There are things in this world that cannot be explained by logic alone. Things that ask you to slow down, to pay attention, to trust something older and quieter than reason. And sometimes, those things come not in the form of visions or voices or signs written in the sky. Sometimes, they come in the form of a horse, standing still, in a field, refusing, with the gentlest and most absolute certainty, to move. This is one of those stories. It begins on a Tuesday morning in early autumn, on a stretch of land outside a small town in rural Tennessee called Harlow's Creek. The land had belonged to the Calloway family for 3 generations. 80-something acres of rolling pasture, a creek that ran amber in dry seasons, a farmhouse that had been added onto so many times over the decades that no 2 walls quite matched. The kind of place that feels like it grew naturally from the ground rather than being built by human hands. Some people who drove past on the county road would slow down without meaning to. Something about the way the land sat in its own quiet. The way the old oak at the edge of the east fence caught the morning light. There was a beauty to it that wasn't loud or obvious, the kind that takes a moment to settle into you, the kind you only recognize once you've already passed it and feel the pull to go back. The horse's name was Opal. She was a bay mare, 16 years old, with a coat the deep reddish brown of old mahogany and a white star on her forehead that had grown slightly lopsided as she aged. She had belonged to the Calloway family since she was a foal, raised by a woman named Ruth Calloway, who had died 2 winters ago at the age of 71 after a short and merciless illness. After Ruth passed, the farm had gone to her son, Daniel. And Daniel, who had grown up on that land but spent his adult life working and contracting in Nashville, had come back not entirely sure what he was supposed to do with any of it. He knew the land. He had grown up walking it, building fences with his father on Saturday mornings, helping his mother bring in the garden at the end of every summer. He remembered the smell of the barn in winter and the sound the creek made after heavy rain. But he had not lived there in nearly 20 years, and returning felt less like coming home and more like visiting a version of himself he had almost forgotten. The farmhouse smelled the way it always had, like cedar and old wool. His mother's reading glasses were still on the windowsill. He had not moved them. In those first weeks back, Daniel moved through the farm slowly. He spent mornings doing small repairs. A loose board on the porch. A gate hinge that had been stiff for years. He cleared brush from the creek bank one afternoon and came in smelling of mud and fallen leaves, and sat at the kitchen table and looked at the walls and thought about how long it takes a person to truly return somewhere. Opal had been left in the care of a neighbor, a retired man named Gil Sutter, during the months between Ruth's death and Daniel's return. Gil had looked after her quietly and without complaint, the way men of his generation handled most things. He was lean and unhurried, with large hands that seemed made for work and a manner of speaking that always felt considered rather than merely filling silence. He handed over the reins when Daniel arrived in September, and he said only one thing as he turned to go. He said, "She's been doing something strange out in the East Field. Has been for a while now. Thought you should know." Daniel had nodded, not thinking much of it. Animals did things sometimes. Habits. Quirks. His mother had always said Opal had a personality bigger than most people he knew. He assumed it was some kind of behavioral thing, maybe tied to grief in the strange way that animals can carry grief without knowing what to call it. But then he saw it for himself. The East Field was the farthest from the farmhouse, separated from the main pasture by a low wooden fence in an old stone wall that had been crumbling slowly for decades. The grass there grew wilder, rougher, because Ruth had let it go mostly untended in her later years. In autumn, the whole thing took on a dusty golden quality that made it look like something from an old painting. Daniel had always liked that field. As a boy he had played in it without permission, building small forts from the fallen wall stones and lying in the tall grass watching clouds. Opal would go there every morning. Not running. not grazing widely the way a horse does when she has the freedom of a full field. She would walk, with a deliberate unhurriedness, to the same spot near the northeast corner, where the old stone wall made an L shape before collapsing entirely into the grass. And there she would stop and stand for sometimes an hour, sometimes longer. Daniel watched her from the fence on the first morning, coffee in hand, the air still cool and carrying the smell of coming rain. He thought she would move on her own. She didn't. He went out to her, put a hand on her neck, spoke to her quietly. She turned her head briefly to look at him, then turned back. Ears forward, head slightly lowered, eyes steady and calm. Not anxious, not troubled, just present. He tried to lead her away. She resisted, not violently, not even with much force, just a quiet leaning backward, a subtle repositioning of her weight, the way a person braces themselves when they don't want to leave a room. He got her back to the main pasture eventually, but the following morning she was there again. Same spot, same posture, same absolute, unhurried stillness. This continued for 2 weeks. Each morning Daniel would come out and find her there. He began to time it. She would arrive at the spot within 20 minutes of being led into the east field, always at that same deliberate walk, always stopping at the same place. She would stand facing slightly northeast, head lowered, ears moving occasionally in small rotations as if tracking a sound. She did not seem distressed. She seemed, as far as Daniel could read her, to be paying attention to something. He began to feel it too, after a while. A quality in that corner of the field. He couldn't name it. It wasn't a feeling of threat or wrongness. It was more like the feeling of standing in a room where someone has just left, a residual presence, a warmth in the air that doesn't quite match the temperature of the rest of the house. He noticed it and then talked himself out of noticing it. Then noticed it again. Daniel mentioned it to Gil one afternoon when the old man came by with some extra hay. Gil listened, arms folded, looking out toward the east field with an expression that was hard to read. "Does she seem scared?" Gil asked. "No," Daniel said. "That's the thing. She seems completely calm." Gil was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your mother used to spend time out there too. Before she got sick. I'd see her from the road sometimes, just standing out by that old wall. I always figured she liked the view." Daniel didn't say anything to that. But something in him shifted, the way the light shifts when a cloud moves, subtle and immediate all at once. That night he pulled out a box of his mother's things. Not the practical items he had already dealt with. The personal things. The notebooks and photographs and letters tied with kitchen string. He sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea that went cold and he read for a long time. His mother had kept a journal. Not every day, but in bursts, only when something needed to be said. The handwriting changed across the years, grew slightly looser, the pen pressure varying with her moods. Daniel read entries about the seasons, about the farm, about missing his father, about missing Daniel himself, in the quiet particular way of mothers whose children leave for the city and don't come back often enough. He sat with those entries for a while before he could move on. And then, in a cluster of entries from about 4 years before her death, he found something else. Ruth had written about the East Field. Not about its beauty or practical use. She had written about something she had been looking for there. The entries were careful and slightly oblique, the way his mother wrote when she was circling something she wasn't sure how to address directly. But across several pages, a picture formed. She had known something was buried there. Not from memory, not from having put it there herself, but from what her own mother had told her before she died. Ruth's mother, a woman named Vera who had died before Daniel was born, had told Ruth that there was something in that corner of the East Field. something that belonged to the family, something hidden during a difficult time, something that should not be lost but also should not be found carelessly. Vera had said it once and not elaborated. Ruth had understood, the way daughters understand certain things their mothers say, that this was something to hold and not press. Ruth had written, "I don't know what I'm looking for exactly. I only know it's there. And I think someday it will be important to find it. But I can't make myself dig. The ground out there has always felt like it's resting. Like whatever's there has been sleeping a long time, and I don't want to be the one to wake it up without a good reason." And then, 2 pages later, "I went again today. I stood there for a long time. Opal came and stood beside me. I don't know how she knows to come, but she always does." Daniel read that line 3 times. He closed the journal and sat in the quiet kitchen and looked at nothing for a while. Outside, the wind moved through the fields. Somewhere in the dark, in the east pasture, he felt rather than knew that Opal was standing in her place. He went out the next morning with no particular plan. He walked to the east field and crossed the damp grass until he reached the place Opal always stood. She was there before him, because she was always there before him. She turned her head as he approached and watched him cross the field with those steady dark eyes. There was something in the way she watched him that he couldn't explain then and couldn't fully explain later. Not human, but not entirely without understanding. He stood beside her. He looked down at the ground. The earth there was no different from the earth anywhere else in the field. Rough grass, a few flat stones, the dry remnants of summer clover. Nothing to mark it. Nothing to say this spot was different from any other. But Opal's ears moved forward, and her head tilted down, and Daniel felt, without logic or evidence, that he was standing in a place that mattered. He went back to the farmhouse and got a shovel. He carried it out to the east field and pushed it into the ground, and the ground was harder than he expected, compacted in the way soil gets when it hasn't been turned in a very long time. He was aware of the quiet absurdity of what he was doing, a man in his early 40s digging up a field because his horse wouldn't leave it and his dead mother had written about it in a journal. He dug anyway. Opal stepped back slightly when he first broke the surface. Just 1 step. Then held still. Her eyes tracked his movements with calm, steady attention. The soil came up in dark chunks, rich and cold. He worked slowly, not rushing. The ground resisted a little more with each foot down, becoming denser, more packed, as if time had pressed it together with purpose. He stopped once to wipe his face and look around at the field, at the pale sky, at Opal standing watchful a few feet away. And then his shovel struck something solid. The sound was not loud. A dull resistance, a vibration that traveled up through the wooden handle and into his palms. Not rock. Not root. Something deliberate. Something placed. He set the shovel aside and knelt. He cleared the soil with his hands, brushing dirt away from the edges of a shape that emerged slowly, the way something long submerged rises when the water finally drains. It was a box. A wooden box, maybe 12 inches long and 8 wide, wrapped in what had once been oilcloth but had mostly decayed to a dark papery layer clinging to the wood. The wood itself was dense and aged but had not fully rotted. The seam at the lid was still tight. Daniel sat back on his heels and looked at it. The light had changed while he was digging. The sun had come across the field at a low angle, catching the dew still sitting in the grass. Everything around him glittered faintly. The air was cool and carrying the smell of turned earth and the distant sweetness of the creek. Behind him, he heard Opal step forward. She had come within a few feet of him, and she was looking down at the box with an expression that could only be described, inadequately, as recognition. Her breathing was slow. Her body was still. She lowered her head in that particular way, the way horses do when they are finally, quietly satisfied. Daniel lifted the box from the ground carefully. It was heavier than he expected. He stood with it held against his chest and looked at Opal, and in the silence between them, in the bright ordinary autumn morning, something passed that he would spend years trying to find language for. He carried the box back to the farmhouse. Opal followed him as far as the gate, then stopped and watched him go, and he had the clear and unshakable sense that she was done now. That her work, whatever it had been, was finished. He set the box on the kitchen table and sat across from it. He made a fresh cup of coffee. He drank it slowly, feeling the particular weight of a moment before it breaks open. He was in no hurry. Whatever was in the box had waited this long and would wait a little longer. After a while, he opened it. Inside, wrapped in layers of cloth that had fared better than the oilcloth outside, he found several things. A small envelope, sealed with wax that had cracked over decades but held. A folded document on thick cream paper, handwritten in formal cursive. A locket on a thin chain, tarnished silver. And at the bottom, wrapped in its own square of cloth, a pocket watch. Heavy brass, slightly green at the edges, the glass crystal intact. He opened the envelope first. The letter inside was written on a single sheet, the ink faded to brownish sepia at the edges. It was addressed to no one specifically, written in a careful, educated hand. The letter said that the items were being placed in safekeeping. That the enclosed document was the deed to a parcel of land that had been disputed and lost, and was being concealed until such time as the rightful heirs were in a position to claim it. The writer noted that the time was uncertain. That whoever found the box should not be surprised to find it long after the writer was gone, and should not be deterred by the passage of time, because the rightness of a thing did not expire. The letter was dated April of 1943. It was signed with a name Daniel did not recognize. But below the signature, added it seemed in a different ink in a later time, were these words, "Given to the keeping of the earth, and to whoever the earth chooses to give it back." Daniel set the letter down and unfolded the document. The deed was long and dense with old legal language. He read it slowly, following the property descriptions through their chains of references to roads and creek bends and tree lines. And then, near the bottom of the first page, in the section designating ownership, he found a surname he knew very well. Calloway. He sat at that kitchen table for a long time. The autumn light moved slowly across the floor, the shadows of the window frames tracking across the worn wood like slow clock hands. The house was utterly still. He could hear the distant sound of a tractor on a neighboring property, the ordinary world going about its business while something extraordinary sat on his kitchen table. He thought about his mother, standing in the east field in her last good years, knowing something was there and unable to bring herself to reach for it. He thought about Vera, passing the knowledge down in one careful sentence, trusting a daughter who would carry it faithfully and then trust it in her own way to a horse in a field and the patience of time. And he thought about the man who had placed the box in the ground in the spring of 1943. He thought about what it must have taken to dig that hole in a field you loved, to wrap those things carefully, to seal them against the weather, to trust the earth with something that mattered. To walk away and not know when or whether anyone would come. That, Daniel thought, was its own kind of faith. If you're still here, settling into the story with us, then maybe you already belong to this quiet gathering. You can leave a like, or simply stay a little longer. We're glad you're here. The legal process took nearly 8 months. A historian and a property attorney examined the deed together. It was authentic. The land it described had changed hands several times since 1943, and most of it could not be recovered through any practical avenue. But a portion of it, roughly 12 acres that had passed through a series of failed development projects, had sat in legal ambiguity for the past decade. That parcel was recoverable. It would take time and paperwork, the attorney said, but it was recoverable. Daniel pursued it without being entirely certain why. The land was not financially dramatic. 12 acres was not a fortune. But letting it go felt like a betrayal of the man who had wrapped a deed in oilcloth and pressed it into the Tennessee earth in the middle of a wartime spring, trusting that someone would come. During the months the process took, he researched. He pulled county records and old census documents in whatever newspaper archives he could find. He learned things about his family that had not been spoken of in his lifetime. There had been a dispute. Pressure had been applied, in the way that pressure was applied to certain families in that era and that place, not always through violence, sometimes simply through paperwork filed without notice, through the slow machinery of disadvantage. Someone had seen it coming, had buried the deed before it could be taken, had written that quiet, steady letter and placed it in the earth like a promise. The locket contained a photograph, tiny and sepia-toned, slightly blurred from age. A woman in her 40s, standing outdoors, squinting against the light. On the back, in handwriting so small Daniel needed a magnifying glass, were 2 words. A first name and a last name. The last name was Calloway. He found her in a group photograph hanging in the upstairs hallway. Back row, 7 people, a church picnic. His great-grandmother. A woman he had known only from that one blurry image, mentioned occasionally by Ruth in the oblique way people mention ancestors they know little about, with respectful uncertainty, acknowledging the life without presuming to understand it. She had stood in that field. He was almost certain of it. Or someone who loved her had stood in that field in the spring of 1943 and done what needed to be done. The pocket watch had an inscription on the back. He found it when he opened the case to check the mechanism. Engraved in small clean letters that had kept their clarity through all the years. For the one who comes after. Daniel had it cleaned and repaired by a watchmaker in Nashville. He set it on the kitchen windowsill when he got it home, beside his mother's reading glasses, which he had still not moved. The land was formally returned to the Calloway name the following February, on a day that was cold and clear, the kind of winter day that feels scrubbed clean. Daniel drove out to see it that afternoon. It was unremarkable in the way that land without buildings looks unremarkable in winter, barren, brown and patient. But he stood at its edge for a while and felt the particular satisfaction of a correction. Not a victory. Just the quiet settling of something that had been crooked for a long time. That spring he planted the east field for the first time since coming back. Wildflowers, the same kinds his mother had let grow there in her later years. He scattered the seed on a long Saturday in March and left the northeast corner untouched, just grass and clover in the crumbling old wall, the patch of disturbed earth slowly knitting itself back together. It felt right to leave it that way. Some places should be marked, even if only by the absence of cultivation. Opal stopped standing in that spot after the box was found. She still came to the east field every day. She still grazed near the old wall in the cool autumn light. But the fixed, particular stillness was gone. She moved the way an old horse moves in a field she knows well, unhurried and easy, without the quality of waiting. Daniel noticed the change without fully deciding what it meant. He thought about it often in the months that followed. In the evenings when the light fell long and golden across the pasture and Opal's shape was visible against the far fence, he would sit on the porch with something warm and think about what it means to keep faith with something you cannot see. What it means to stand in one place, day after day, with a patience that does not waver. Waiting for the person who needs to know to finally arrive. He thought about how we talk about animals. The careful qualifications we place around any suggestion that they understand things. We say they seem to know. We say it appeared as if. We protect ourselves from the full implication of what we're observing, because the full implication is a little too large for ordinary language. But Daniel had stood beside Opal on the morning he found the box. He had felt her step forward when the shape emerged from the earth. He had seen her lower her head in that particular way. And he had understood, with a certainty that required no qualification that she had known. Not through language or deduction, but in the way living things know the ground they share, and carry in their deep animal selves an awareness of presence and absence in the weight of things that matter. His mother had stood in that field and felt something. Opal had known that Ruth stood there, had absorbed the habit, had understood that this place was important, that the standing mattered, that the attention mattered. And when Ruth was gone, Opal had kept standing. For the one who comes after. Gil came by in November and they sat on the porch with coffee and watched the field go through its afternoon light. At the end of it, Gil told him something he had been holding for a while. He said that Ruth, in the last months of her life, had come to him one afternoon and said, "If something happens to me before Daniel comes back, watch what Opal does in the East Field. She knows something I never quite got to." Gil had nodded, the way he nodded at things, and he had watched. And when Daniel arrived, he had said what he had said. Just that one sentence. "Thought you should know." He had trusted the rest to work itself out. Daniel thought about that for a long time after Gil drove away. He stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the dark fields and thought about his mother, sitting across from Gil in her last autumn, handing him a piece of the thread and trusting him to hold it until the right hands arrived. He thought about the way things get passed on. Not always in documents and deeds. Sometimes in a single sentence given to the right person at the right moment. Sometimes in a habit of standing, continued faithfully by an old horse who loved the woman who taught her. Opal lived 2 more years. She lived them well. Old age had taken her stamina but not her temperament. She still came when Daniel called her name, which she had always done and which he understood now to be a kind of grace. In her last winter she slowed. She spent more time in the barn, and Daniel spent more time there with her, bringing extra hay, sitting sometimes on an overturned bucket in the warm dark, listening to her breathe. He told her things in those evenings, the way you talk to animals when no one is listening, without self-consciousness. He told her about the land recovery. He told her about the watchmaker. He told her about the photograph in the locket. He told her about his mother. She died on a morning in late March, in the manner of very old horses, quietly and without drama, in the familiar warmth of the barn. Daniel sat with her for a while before anyone else came. He buried her in the East Field, at a slight rise in the land where you could see the creek if you stood at the right angle. He dug the grave himself over 2 days, working slowly. He planted a single apple tree above her. He chose a winesap, an old American variety, tart and firm, the kind grown in Tennessee for centuries. He put it in the ground on a cold April morning, the last frost still in the soil, and tamped the earth down carefully around the roots and stood back and looked at the young tree standing in the open field. It bloomed in its second spring. Small white blossoms opening in the last week of April, when the air still carried the cold of the season ending in the warmth of the one beginning. Daniel stood at the fence one morning and watched the tree in the early light, the blossoms bright against the pale sky, and was aware of being inside something he could not see the edges of. A long story. A very long and patient story, still unfolding. He thought of the inscription on the watch. For the one who comes after. He thought that perhaps those words had not been written only about him, or only about his mother. Perhaps they had been written for everyone who has ever stood at the edge of something they don't fully understand and chosen to stay. Everyone who has ever trusted the stillness of a living thing that cannot speak. Everyone who has ever felt the weight of what is passed down, not only in deeds and silver lockets, but in memory and habit and the faithfulness of creatures who love without language. Perhaps those words had been written for the moment itself. For this very moment, in all the moments like it, when someone finally arrives at the place that has been waiting for them, and understands that the waiting was an act of love. The apple tree grew. And the East Field, in spring, was full of flowers. That is where the story rests now. in a field in Tennessee, in a farmhouse that smells like cedar and old wool, in a pocket watch catching the winter light on a windowsill beside a pair of reading glasses that have not been moved, in a deed folded carefully into a cedar box in the top drawer of a desk in the back bedroom, in a photograph of a woman squinting against the light, standing on land she loved and knew she might not keep, doing what needed to be done, and in the memory of a bay mare named Opal, who walked to the same corner of the same field every morning and waited, calm and certain, for the one who would come after. Some things in this world cannot be explained by logic. Some things ask only that you slow down, that you pay attention, that you follow a horse to a corner of a field and trust what she already knows. If this story stayed with you, if you found yourself settling into its quiet, then maybe it found the right ears tonight. You can leave a like below, or share a thought in the comments. And if you'd like to return for more stories like this one, told slowly and with care, you can subscribe and stay with us. We'll be here. We're not going anywhere.